Hi everyone, welcome to the Deakin webinar where we discuss the new normal behavior in businesses. Uh, few house rules before we get started. So it's best preferred that you guys use the speaker's view to get the best view, and also the moderator and panelist video would be on. Rest all of you would be muted on video as well as speaker. And this session will be recorded for training and practice purposes. So hi all, a lot has happened in the year 2020. Many of us are keen to remove this year from our lives as we have been facing challenges which are incomprehensible and full of uncertainties. However, 2020 will be remembered as being one that changed the way we look at crisis management and then survive and thrive as people and as a business. The financial impact of a pandemic continues to be huge. Companies, countries, people are experiencing that emotionally, financially, personally, and professionally. To discuss in detail about the same, on behalf of Deakin University and its alumni committee, I'm delighted to welcome you to the webinar on the new normal in the business and consumer behavior during COVID-19. To help us deliberate on this topic, we have with us industry expert Mr. Scott Brown, MD and Group CEO, Crassus Ventures Corp Singapore. Scott is currently engaged as a professional personal mentor and business coach with company founders, directors, and CEOs in Australia and all around the world. He is an internationally certified NLP master practitioner and facilitator integral semantics. This sits on a sound knowledge base in object relation psychology and cognitive behavior psychology. Next, we have Rajiv Dubey, advisory board member and professor of practice, Deakin Business School. Rajiv is an Indian industry veteran with nearly 36 years of multi-sector experience, having served at the highest echelons of two of the three biggest Indian global MNCs, Tata and Aditya Birla. He has served on the several Indian and foreign boards in various capacities and brings deep insights in corporate governance, management, and transformation of business as varied as auto, metals, mining, power and renewables, cement trading, textile, retail, and financial services. Last but not the least, I have Ravneet Pawha, Global Deputy Vice President and CEO, Southeast Asia, Deakin University. With over 27 years of experience in the international education sector, Ravneet has been instrumental in establishing the global collaborations and strategic partnerships. She has developed Australian education collaborations specifically for Deakin University in India and South Asia, and she has also contributed to the immense success globally. She is an inspirational leader and a passionate entrepreneur. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of welcoming Ms. Ravneet Pawha to make strong remarks and also present her view on the topic.
A very warm welcome to this webinar, which is presented by Deakin University India Alumni Chapter. Good afternoon, good evening, my dear friends. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. We proudly promote and celebrate the diversity and the depth of Deakin alumni. Deakin University has a strong presence in India and is connected with thousands of alumni across the country. The Deakin Alumni Chapter in India aims to facilitate meaningful, lifelong communication amongst its Indian alumni and alumni across the world. The chapter was launched in 2017 formally and has 3 committees in Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore. Friends, as you are all aware, COVID-19 has profoundly changed the way businesses are run and people think. Both businesses and consumers are setting into the new normal, and we really don't know what the new normal is, and people around the world are learning to live with this new normal on a daily basis. The challenges of adapting and adopting to the new normal business and consumers in unlearning and reinventing, and the nature is testing our capability and value systems. In this webinar, we aim to identify the key challenges and provide recommendations for a possible roadmap as we move towards this unprecedented future. And this pandemic has actually made us think that life could be different and will be different, and how we deal with the difference by being more resilient, by being more careful, by being more sensitive, by inclusive, and by being together in this is the way forward. So what is the current situation? Businesses and lives across the globe have been affected. Employers are managing with less staff and wondering what to do in the future. Majority of people are operating from home. Both businesses and consumers are shifting to online portals. International borders are closed, affects the international business, and education is profound. What is the way forward? Identify and work on new challenges faced by this global workforce due to the pandemic. Online professional training and development will provide opportunity to keep up with the new changes of the world. Will this take us to the new normal? I don't know, and neither do any of us do. But we have to prepare, and we have to make sure that whatever we do it with complete understanding, passion, commitment, and a promise to ourselves and to the societies we live in. I'm going to now ask Rajiv to talk about what his initial thoughts are on what this new normal really looks like. And from an industry perspective, Rajiv, sitting in Mumbai, which is the capital of COVID-19 apparently in India, where do you think we are going and what do you think is going to happen?
Thank you, Ravneet, for setting the tone and placing the cat amongst the pigeons. I wish there was a simple answer that I could provide in terms of the challenges that society faces today, and including industry. I mean, these are unprecedented times. I don't think in living memory, any one of us have gone through a period such as this, where nations have been isolated, societies have been isolated, people have been disconnected, economic supply chains broken, unemployment to the levels that we're seeing now, the surges, the downward surges in the economy, which are touching new levels in every nation that you can think of. So it's very unprecedented what we're going through, and I don't think any one of us who have been part of industry or even otherwise have a template available to us by which we can chart out the course for the coming tomorrow. There have been disruptions at the institutional level, and there have been disruptions that have taken place at the individual level. I think all of us as individuals have been impacted by this pandemic in one form or the other. Somebody that we've known around us has been affected. Some life has been lost. Families have gone into mourning, and it's a situation that even war has not presented to society something like this in the past, and it has thrown up questions as to really what the purpose of life is. In some cases, what people have started to question what is really dear to them in terms of the essentials. Relationships have come into question. So there's a lot of soft impact that this pandemic is having, and I don't think it'll be only business and industry that will emerge in a different fashion coming out of this pandemic, but I think society in general, as it emerges from this crisis, may be thinking very differently about all that we have pursued in the past. And I think new meanings are being attached to what is really meaningful in life, because this virus, unlike the other diseases that we have faced, is fraught with uncertainty, and the windows are very short. One, if you get affected, you have a 14-day window to come out or a 14-day window to just lose your life, with no treatment being in place. So it's a very short window, and many of us, I think, don't even realize that so much of life is being affected around us. And that itself is a sign of danger, because unless there is a treatment around, we are all susceptible to be affected in one form or the other, either health-wise or economically, or in terms of the mental state of awareness that all of us are in. And what we're seeing today is that individuals and corporations have been forced to focus on a short-term horizon, because the medium term and the long term is still unknown. So we are forced to look at the immediate horizon available to us, plan from day to day, plan for a month at best, plan for 2 months at best, and take life as it comes. And you're seeing this also in the case of the lockdown, which have been there in various nations. The lockdowns are being institutionalized for about 3 or 4 weeks, and when you come closer to the end of that period, you again take a call, and it's extended. So the situation is such that it is not allowing any long-term planning. And even if you look at businesses, they are in the mode of survivability, that if they can survive this period, then only they can think of growth. So I don't think very many businesses at this point in time are talking about growth. Some of the businesses who benefited because of the pandemic, not in any negative way, but in a positive way, are the e-commerce companies, for instance, who've seen a surge in their business operations, and people and businesses involved with the digital world. But willy-nilly, the brick and mortar of the corporate world is focused on just this aspect of survivability for the short window ahead of them, and planning on a day-to-day basis. So while the corporate sector in India has started to come back to life in some form with activity in some sectors up to 40% of their peak levels, and in some stray cases even up to 70 to 80%. But the majority of the corporate sector, as I'm given to understand by colleagues in the industry, is still at a suboptimal level of about 30 to 40%. It's increasing every month, but it's a slow uptick. So it's a wait and watch approach, and I think the strategy to approach tomorrow keeps getting reviewed every day, and it's on a running basis that corporations are relooking at their immediate future. So that's what I'll say, and hold my thoughts for the questions and answers that would follow later.
Thanks, Rajiv. I think you have sort of summed it up in your introductory remarks quite well, to say that we all are wondering where the future is going to be. Definitely, I don't think growth is on the agenda. Sustainability is on the agenda. And then I think really balancing our lives and balancing the important parts of our lives. And of course, health is a big one in that. Having said that, I will now move on to Scott. It's an absolute pleasure, Scott, and thank you for joining us from Melbourne. So we'd be very happy to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ravneet, and thank you very much for having me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start by thanking the entire team at Deakin for inviting me to speak and to contribute to this event. It's a massive topic, it's a massive theme, and as Rajiv has mentioned before, and Ravneet before me, it's affecting every single one of us in the entire world slightly differently, but no one's missing out. We're all being impacted significantly. I'd also like to drop in with an apology on behalf of my Australian accent. Hopefully you can all understand my words. If there is any misunderstanding, feel free to point that out later on. Happy to repeat. I'd also like to perhaps pre-frame my contribution by saying that I'm going to attempt to bring a global perspective, one which also incorporates that of India, as well as a specific Australian view on this topic. Now, to do that with any real degree of detail is obviously not possible in terms of the time that we have. So it'll be a very generic or general overview, but I hope that it can serve as a good introduction for some great questions as a follow-up. And in this global overview, I've selected some specific countries that typify, I believe, the spectrum of behavioural change, both in business and in communities across the globe. So, COVID-19, for most of us, myself particularly, unprecedented in our lifetimes. I think in terms of when I looked at the topic and gave some thought to how to tackle it and what would come up for me as I read it, the word during in that topic is something which I find quite interesting. We can only really speculate on what the new norm will look like for all of us after COVID-19. However, one observation that I would make is that behavioural change occurs much faster and it's more easily attained during a crisis. What remains to be seen, I think, is to what degree the observed changes in behaviour will continue on a forward trajectory after or on the other side of COVID-19, and how much of those behavioural changes will gravitate back towards known and proven behaviours and methodologies from the past. We humans have relatively short memories, and as the sense of crisis and the fight or flight fades, and we begin to find ourselves becoming more and more comfortable, it can be a very easy slide back to past known behaviours. Now, obviously, this entire paradigm will likely play out differently around the globe, in every country, in every region, and the way in which it'll be playing out will be based on culture, politics, history, and more basically, it will be a function of values and preferences and the balance between economic and community health position. In response to the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic, countries around the world have initially adopted one of either two strategies to combat, mitigate, or manage it. Those two extreme strategies have been eradication of the virus or suppression of the virus. Initially, India, whilst I was in Hyderabad at the beginning of this year and for the first 4 months, adopted a fairly comprehensive total lockdown in order to either eradicate or suppress the virus, and then to suppress the virus temporarily to enable expansion of healthcare resources to cope. Now the resolution seems to be a combination of strategies because of the realisation that the national economy can't afford to adopt the eradication process and the time that that would involve. I'm unsure if India's strategy has now become that of herd mentality or herd immunity, which is a strategy being propagated in certain countries around the world, in which BAU or business or life as usual prevails, and those that survive are expected to have developed an immunity to the virus. It remains a constantly moving and evolving picture in India as it does the rest of the world, in my view. If we take New Zealand, for instance, they adopted an eradication strategy from the get-go. On March the 25th, Level 4 restrictions shut down all schools, businesses, and entire social interaction across the country immediately. After 1 month, it was determined that the virus had been eliminated, and by the 8th of June, a graduated loosening of those restrictions now sees New Zealand on Level 1 restrictions, so no restrictions other than border controls, and their economy is operating relatively normally. Its economy has suffered, but it's recovering faster from a short, sharp, definitive halt compared to, say, several half stops with short partial reopenings in between. But the current new norm for New Zealand is still isolated from the rest of the world. The future norm for New Zealand, I think, will be a function of what unfolds globally, as opposed to merely internally. Obviously, some observations as how that has worked for New Zealand. It's a much smaller population, it's smaller landmass, it's an island, so it has no land borders. It's also more isolated in terms of international travel. So very different demographic makeup and culture to India, obviously, but also other countries in the world. My personal view is that this approach appears to have worked for New Zealand, but it certainly would not have worked for India, in my opinion. In fact, the initial lockdown in India demonstrated that, in my view. If we take somewhere like Sweden, they adopted a business as usual strategy, the herd immunity strategy, from the start. And that is now being re-examined by the Swedes in the last month. But so far, their new norm differs very little from their previous existence pre-COVID. So the business and community behaviour remains relatively unchanged, and the business metrics have changed very little other than their trade balances. If we think about the US, obviously a very complex observation, they embarked on very much a herd immunity strategy led by their commander-in-chief. But due to its different political system compared with that of Sweden, the heavy impact on more disadvantaged parts of the population has seen deep divides and conflict open up, and the US finds itself in a state of complete turmoil. It's trying to maintain a business as usual economy while struggling with community and health divides. The political election in November is also playing a role in how the US will change its response to COVID-19. Populism might dictate who and which strategy wins. Economic metrics are a mixture of dramatic off-the-cliff perspectives versus also straight-out denial. If we look at the USX versus unemployment figures versus the valuation of the US dollar globally, we can see significant upward and downwards, almost knee-jerk reactions consistently. In Australia, we actually need to look back to the aftermath of World War II, 1945, in order to get a sense of the impact of this pandemic. Metrics in health, such as mortality and hospital admittance, economic metrics such as reduction in GDP, unemployment, government revenue reduction, skyrocketing expenses, and community issues such as mental health have not been as critical since the World War II aftermath. Even the global financial crisis is insignificant across these metrics. It's true that Australia and its capacity to manage or partially absorb the increased impact of the pandemic on its healthcare system places it in a better position than many other countries in the world. However, Australia's geographic isolation has resulted in a certain false sense of security and distance. As an Australian myself, I say a false sense of security because due to air travel in particular, we all know that the world has become a much smaller place than it once was. Prior to May this year, I was spending 50% of my time in India and the rest juggled between Africa, the Middle East, Singapore, and then home in Australia. So we in Australia have seen an initially successful suppression of the virus infections whilst I was in India, now explode due to a sense of complacency, largely due to that false sense of security or separation. We are now actually seeing, specifically in the state of Victoria, a second wave of relatively epic proportions. Whilst the other Australian states are relatively active case-free, they are choosing to maintain internal border controls as Victoria faces an escalation in daily cases. Victoria will go from stage 3 to stage 4 at midnight tomorrow night. This will see all businesses closed other than essential services, no visitors or gatherings in homes. The Australian and Victorian economies are under significant pressure. The jobless rate is expected to hit 25% by Christmas nationally, whilst a pre-budgeted surplus has now become the largest Australian economic budget deficit since 1945. And at that time, the deficit represented 28% of Australia's total GDP. So massive government support packages, including employment subsidies for business and employees who are unable to work from home during the restrictions, and the doubling of welfare payments as well as access to personal super has exceeded the figures predicted by government. Observations of community behaviour see the majority of people doing the right thing, but a minority disregarding stay-at-home directives, avoiding self-isolation, and continuing to attend work in spite of COVID symptoms. Businesses are attempting to exert better governance, more meetings and interactions are being done online. Large listed firms are seeing boards and executives taking temporary pay cuts. Pivoting and innovation is emerging as businesses look to create opportunity rather than just merely to survive the storm. One example here in Australia is a company that builds theatre production stages and exhibition stages, who's completely out of work due to the complete shutdown of that industry. The company has pivoted to use its infrastructure and employees to begin making home office furniture to service the massive work from home market which has emerged in Australia. Their monthly turnover has quadrupled. We're also seeing the recognition of work-life balance and the importance of mental health emerge far more than pre-COVID in Australia. Some other specific behaviours that have evolved: online lectures, as Rajiv mentioned before, e-commerce, cashless transactions are seeing our society change. Working from home has probably been, and I think will be, the biggest game changer in the Australian economy, and it obviously has ripple effects. The use of hand sanitizer and masks and distancing, previously non-existent in the Australian culture compared with China and other parts of Asia, has become quite prevalent, obviously, and is part of the restrictions and guidelines now. Lastly, China's economic ascendancy, in my personal view, will continue. This is also emphasised by their internal recovery, exaggerated or not. I'll have more to say potentially about China in their role in geopolitics during follow-up questions, but certainly no question that they play a major role. So in summary, I think that's just a snapshot of a handful of countries and observations of behaviour, both community and business. They're very, very different. And as I said, lots of different countries are experiencing similar or variations to that. So a global pandemic with lots of moving parts, and we're all in this together, but the way in which different countries and cultures adapt and meet this challenge will obviously vary. And so a very complicated, challenging time ahead.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Scott. I think your views across sort of on a global scale have been, very carefully thought about and put together. And I think that for the benefit of our audience, I think this is really good to know your perspective, and it's interesting to see the comparison between, say, a country like India and a country like Australia, India with its diverse population and Australia with its population spread, wide and far. But still, we still face the same issues. We still face the same problems. Businesses shut, lives on hold, like you also rightly said, sort of community issues, mental health issues. Deakin has 62,000 students in the campuses, and all of them are studying online. When we start to rethink about the strategy going forward, you really wonder how you're going to sustain this and let this grow. And I think all our alumni who are connected to this would also understand that, for a country like India or Australia, social distancing is a very hard one, because Australia is so passionate about, the beer on a Friday evening and the sport, every afternoon, and the community engagement and all of that. So I think it's going to be a different world as we go into the future. So I'm going to now pass on to Abhishek to look at some questions that he has thought about. And then I think we will open to questions from the audience.
Abhishek, your audio is not audible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
All right, great. Hello everyone, and we have a first question for Mr. Rajiv. The question is, what would be the most suitable makeover for a large market in India, which is classified as unorganized sector?
Thank you. Abhishek, for that question. I can only give a somewhat distant answer to that question because most of us have worked in the organized sector, but we engage with the unorganized sector in a remote fashion. There are if you look at the unorganized sector, perhaps you can divide it in two. One is the self-employed unorganized sector, where you have the roadside vendors, to give an example, or the daily wage earners who move from job to job. And then there's the unorganized sector, which is linked indirectly to the organized sector. If you look at the construction industry, much of the labor force that is employed over there comes from the organized sector, but stays with the project for a period of time and before it moves on to the next project. So I think as this pandemic has exposed the real disruption to the lives that came about happened much more for the unorganized sector in terms of the migrant labor scenes that are there in everybody's mind in terms of the hardships that they went through as they went from the areas that they worked in to the security of their own homes in far-flung states. And I think it's been food for thought, and especially for the corporate sector, because certainly for the segment of the unorganized sector, which is indirectly linked to the corporate sector, the logistics sector feeding into, let's say, the cement industry, or the labor force feeding into the construction industry. I think corporates have to realize that it's not just the employees on their role that they need to engage with and to worry about, but they have to lay out a much more robust system of security for the people involved all along the chain of work. And while people in the organized sector have had their salaries protected for some time, even if they've taken a cut, it's a 30% cut or a 40% cut, but the jobs have been secure, their payments are coming through. There have been layoffs in the organized sector, but compared to the difficulties that the unorganized sector has faced, where right from day one, when the lockdown was announced, they lost their jobs, they lost their livelihoods, and I'm sure they're going through a harrowing time in terms of supporting their families back home. So I think this should be food for the corporate sector, with indirect linkages into the unorganized market to extend their arm of well-being and support in some manner across the unorganized sector. That part of the unorganized sector will also find it difficult to link back to the organized sector, because having been bitten once and having moved away from their workplace, they're going to take their time to come back to industry. And I think this is ground for reflection for the corporate sector as to what new measures, what new policies need to be adopted, so that not only for something like this, but for even in the good times, there is an arm of well-being and support available to that unorganized element of the labor workforce that supports the organized sector in a big way. As far as the self-employed unorganized sector is concerned, I think they're self-sufficient, so they have a chance to bounce back that much more faster. The shops on the roadside or around the corner have a way of bouncing back that much more faster, because the variables are all under their control. So as soon as the opening up of the market happens, they have a way of organizing themselves much better. But for those who are linked to the labor force of the in the organized sector, I think it's going to be some time before they come back to that phase of earning a steady livelihood. And all of us who are involved with industry in one form or the other have to think, even as they are distant today, what do we need to do to give them that sense of security, that sense of confidence that what might have happened in the past is an aberration arising out of circumstances that were not foreseen by any. And in future, there'll be a much greater sense of security for them as they engage with the organized sector. So those are my thoughts around the organized sector, which is a very, very big part of the Indian labor force, and has a very, very crucial role to play in getting the GDP clock ticking. We don't realize it until moments like this, that what kind of role that large workforce plays for corporate India. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. I think that should be quite enlightening for all of us. The next question we have is for Scott. Scott, the question is, will Australia open up its market more to Indian goods, replacing the Chinese ones in their market, or it will be purely make in Australia? The question is directed more towards food and beverage industry. What are your thoughts on this, Scott?
Thank you, Abhishek. I think the answer about this, although it seems a really simple and straightforward question, the answer's not that simple. I think it's as much about geopolitics as it is specifically about COVID. So I note that the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was part of a trade delegation to India last year. And from memory, a lot of noise was made, but I remain unconvinced of anything concrete being achieved. In fact, and I'm not sure of these exact figures, but I have done some research on it. Since India's independence, there have been approximately 800 odd G2G and commercial third-party MOUs that have been initiated in regards to trade and signed. But in fact, less than 10 of them, 10, have been actualised and put into practice. So in relationship between Australia and India and that trade situation, we've got my company, Crassus Ventures, through one of its subsidiaries, Crassus Infrastructure in the water space, has been appointed in an official cooperation agreement with the South Australian Government, Department of Water, Land and Environment, to develop opportunities with the territory governments of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana and other Indian territories for the importing of Australian innovation, products and technologies in water treatment and the application in actual physical pilot programs on the ground in India. Now, I know that's not specific to the food and beverages sector, but I'll get to that in a second. Added to the context for this is that China has imposed bans on the Australian beef and dairy industries. Australia, while it has not imposed bans on China's imports at the moment, to my knowledge, the tensions over China's aggressive activities in the South China Sea and the request from the United States for Australia to join its condemnation of it sees things in a really delicate balance, in my view, geopolitically. So I think in general, but particularly the food and beverage sector, there could be real opportunities to develop and actualise strategic alignment and supply chains and trade agreements between Australia and India. Australia is keen to avoid being over-dependent, in my view, on Chinese imports, given the potential instability of these relationships. However, it is true, in my view, that Australia will likely look to more localisation of its products in terms of manufacturing. But to that end, I know economically that that will be linked to the cost of goods sold, wages, etc., will play a part. So therein lies a potential opportunity for India in that regard, not just in the food and beverages sector, but more widely as well.
Thank you, Scott. The next question I have is for Ravneet. Ravneet, the question is, how is the university sector dealing with the consumption currently? Do you think there are students looking at overseas education, and what measures are being taken by the university so far?
So I think students are still, I mean, there are lots of surveys that have been done in the recent past, and I think that on a monthly basis, things are changing. However, one thing constant is that students are definitely still looking at international education, and they're definitely still wanting to get the exposure and the experience to be in another country, on another sort of on-campus platform. But the reality of the matter is it is not happening for the next couple of months at least. So for example, if we pick up, say, Australia as an example, definitely till the early half of next year, very early of next year, which is trimester 1 in Australia, we don't see international students getting on campus. So the other option then for students to look at international education is online. And I think that slowly it's starting to have a reality check, and students are starting to think about it as an option. I think now we all do understand and know that Australia has also, as Canada and UK, opened up to post-study work rights for students who are still in their home country and studying online. So that gives, I think, a good boost of confidence to the students, because you would realize that 90% of the student market going from India to Australia or even to Canada is a potential migrant market. So students are looking at permanent residency or looking at least work rights for a few years after they finish their studies. But this policy by the Australian government has been encouraging for the sector. And we see that parents and students are getting a lot more confident about the possibility of starting online and moving to on campus as soon as the international borders open up. And that is true not just for Australia. I think that is true for the UK as well as for Canada. I don't think US is encouraging that. And I would put US in a different basket at the moment. But I think most other countries have been encouraging the Indian students or students from other parts of the world as well to look at continuing their passion and their dreams to study overseas.
Thank you, Ravneet. Next question we have for all the panelists is a very interesting question. What is the new normal?
Let's start with Rajiv.
Because we have been having this kind of a question on a personal and a daily level, and we talk about the new normal. So that's where I think it's born. What is the new normal?
I think the new normal is being defined on a daily basis. I don't think we have a static definition of the new normal. And that evolution of the normal situation would evolve until we have the answers as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned. We are living, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, on a very short-term basis because we don't have visibility of how things would pan out 6 months from now, a year from now. When as being associated with the corporate sector, we used to have at one point in time a 5-year business plan. And given the way the world was changing, the 5-year business plan went out of the window a long time back. And now we have much shorter time frames of planning for business cycles. And we do it on a revolving basis. So every year we look at the next 3 years as to what our business is going to look like, and when the year ends, then we again extend our horizons for the next 3 years. So it's this situation that we're facing is something like that. You know, we start our day and we look at the next this current month and the next few months as to how is the situation evolving of the environment around us, and take a call and take a judgment call and move forward. As far as lives are concerned, we are living day to day. You know, today we are allowed to travel 2 kilometers from our house. Some are travel within the pin code. So we have to figure out our lives within that horizon. So I guess the normal, we are not in a normal situation. I would say we are in an abnormal situation at this point in time, and we're coping with it on a daily basis. I think the steady state will evolve when we have some solutions, coming out of the health sector to the crisis that we are facing. Then we can take a call as to how will we emerge from the situation that we are faced in. At this point in time, as we grapple with the economic environment, we grapple with the societal environment around us, I think the emerging behavioral characteristic, which I can say should be the new normal, or is emerging out to be the new normal and could possibly continue to be the new normal, is the surfacing of human empathy. You know, trying to reach out and help people as much as possible, because all of us are vulnerable at this stage. So I think the only great attribute which would emerge out of this possibly, and I hope it would stay when things stabilize, is the empathy that we should have for each other as we grapple with crises, either in our corporations or in our families, or amongst our friends or society. And whatever we need to do it through this lens of trying to help humankind in whichever way we can, big or small. So I wouldn't have really an answer as to what the new normal would be. I'm myself a learner at this stage. I'm changing my views every day, practically as I become familiar with facts around me. Data emerging on the pandemic is also being revised. I think leaders also in nations are taking calls every day as to how the nation needs to be run. So I think we are all in a mode where we are taking in things around us and trying to define the lives for the immediate and the short term. It'll be a while before we can take a view, anything beyond 3 months, I would say, at this point in time.
All right, thank you, Rajiv. Scott, what would be your perspective on what is the new normal and when is the new normal?
Thanks, Abhishek. Look, I'd have to reiterate Rajiv's point about the rapidly changing dynamics that we're faced with, and the nature of the uncertainty, and our attempts to grapple with that uncertainty. The observation of human behaviour is that generally we tend to want to try and even just terming this the new normal. We're desperately looking to try and find a place where things have stopped and we have a stationary picture of industry, of business, of relationships, of geopolitics, of trade, all a snapshot of it as if it's stationary. I think one of the things that the new normal might involve, and from here on I'm going to be guessing a little bit, so I'm prepared to pull my neck out and have some guesses, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. But I think in the interest of exploring this and opening some things up, I'm happy to have a stab at some things I think could happen. One of them, in terms of the new norm, will be, I think, the realisation that rather than us trying to look for a snapshot, like a still photograph, and that will be our new norm, I think our past norm or normal was a stationary photograph. I think the new normal might involve people realising that things are not stationary, they're constantly moving. So rather than us looking for a still black and white photograph, potentially we'll be looking for a movie or a video where things are going to be constantly changing, and that our adaptability, our capacity to adapt to something that's constantly moving may actually have been improved as a result of this experience that the world is going through. In Australia, I think the overall picture is likely to vary in localised areas, that is remote, rural, regional cities and towns, compared with our capital cities. I think even between Australia's 5 capital cities, there'll be differences as well. I think there'll be significant shedding of existing jobs and employment types. I think there will actually be net new jobs created in Australia. I think those net new jobs will be home-based businesses, online businesses, as a result of the outsourcing of services from large CBD-based corporates. I think due to the increased flow of people to regional towns as online and alternative employment opportunities develop, the demand for increased regional infrastructure as a result of that decentralisation from capital cities such as Melbourne and Sydney will actually start to play into effect. And obviously I note that that potentially could be in stark contrast to the urbanisation that we see happening in India. Growth in regional populations in Australia as a result of this is, and then the ripple effects of that regional population growth, land development, infrastructure, housing construction, schools, healthcare, community, places of worship, sporting and recreational facilities, retail, road and rail networks, even airports. So I think that improved quality of life, work-life balance, working from home, we'll see less congestion on roads, less pollution as a result of less travel into our CBDs, potentially a cleaner environment in Australia, smarter and more innovative for sure. I think one of the most significant things that we'll see in the new norm in Australia, but potentially globally, is the massive growth in fintech. We're looking potentially more and more at a cashless society. So fintech and the growth in fintech startups and existing organisations is already noticeably on the move. But unemployment at the end of 2020 in Australia is anticipated to be higher than that at the end of World War II in 1945. So there is an opportunity of building back cleaner, using construction of housing, which housing construction occupies about 8% of Australia's GDP. So there's potential and a good way for government to stimulate the economy and provide jobs by turning this towards social housing for homeless, disadvantaged, at risk and welfare. This can solve this undersupply while stimulating the economy. I think also in Australia there is a significant need to restore funding to universities. I've read in my research that the estimated gap to meet current requirements in Australia is 4.7 billion Australian dollars. That is even more pertinent when we consider that the flattening of the COVID curve in Australia is currently primarily resting on university-backed research. To what Ravneet mentioned about international students, I think international students and research in Australia is something which is a significant player which will increase in return. I looked up some figures today. 70% of Swinburne University's revenue comes from overseas students, the majority of which are from India. I'm not sure of the figures for Deakin. I wasn't able to put my finger on those. But my observation also would be this: there's pressure on both the demand side, that is from the students, as well as the supply side in terms of universities requiring revenue and having opportunity to offer courses and content. Globally, I think things will differ not just from country to country, but region to region and city to city, and even across one city. We'll be facing a global health crisis. So customising and the reactionary approach that we're currently dealing with this crisis we'll see, I believe, significant consolidation of the health sector across all areas: research, technology, patient care, insurance, infrastructure, even business models, as I think the value chain is actually going to change. Global recession, even depression for some countries, unemployment, increased welfare requirements, increased division, and increased disadvantaged populations, and potentially increased crime in some areas. And I think one of the largest things to face is the increasing geopolitical tensions that we're starting to see. And that likely instability in government changes is going to add to the uncertainty that will be part of our ongoing norm. And that norm won't be a stationary picture. My view is that we'll be changing daily, hourly, whatever it is. And I think that the opportunity, or shall I say both the disaster and the delight for us as human beings, is for us to be able to learn to grapple with not just a stationary picture of the new norm, but a moving movie that's constantly changing.
Thank you, Scott. The next question comes in for Rajiv. Rajiv, do you think companies like Infosys, TCS, Reliance, and the other big giants in India will now have a bigger advantage over the smaller companies since they already have a better infrastructure and going digital will only be the solution for survival? Will this be the end of the smaller companies of that particular industry?
Thank you, Abhishek. No, I really don't. I really don't think so. If you look at let's say Infosys and TCS, did you mention TCS? Infosys and TCS, and now Reliance, which is getting into the getting bigger into the to the digital space. If you look at TCS and companies like TCS and Infosys, they've essentially been operating in the B2B space. They have not been operating into the B2C space. And the Reliances of the world now are, having operated in the B2B, are now getting into B2C. And if you look at the major disruptors that are coming in the B2C space, in fact, they are coming in from the startup end. I mean, video conferencing was a feature that was always available to the world, but it took a Zoom to popularize it in various ways. I mean, this feature was available to Microsoft, it was available to Google, with everyone. But who capitalized on it was a young startup who made it extremely user-friendly to consume as a service. So I think there'll always be space for smaller players. And always space for people who can tap directly into understanding consumer behavior and consumer insights. What happens to companies that are working essentially on the B2B front, they have an insight into into the eventual markets only through the eyes of their intermediate customer. They are not so linked directly to the markets themselves, although they should be if they were to even advance their services to the B2B sector. But dealing with the intermediary, the disruption is usually happening with those companies that are able to read the consumer behavior and the future consumer trends much better. And those are companies that are out there in the market, engaging with the customers, identifying their needs on a regular basis. And many of the technology startups are newer companies in the Western world and as also in India. So I think there would be place, in fact, the larger companies would find it difficult, and I'm sure as we go ahead, I'm not privy to the thinking of the boards of companies like Infosys and TCS, But I'm sure the business model that they've run and perfected over a period of time needs to undergo a change of some form or the other, where they need to get connected more directly to the markets and perhaps play with some end products that they can bring directly to the consumers. So I would be very happy if some of these large IT companies were to create the next TikTok, you know, or the next Zoom or whatever else is catching the fancy of the market. I think they have a challenge in their hands. Their history, their legacy is somewhat of a hindrance in them being as nimble as some of the leaner companies that are coming to the market. So my guess is, and my understanding is that newer and younger players would continue to survive. I think there's a lot of understanding of technology that lies with the younger generation that is creating these technology-based startups. And they would continue to be supported in terms of funding if the idea is sound, and they would turn into some of these large corporations over a period of time. I think if you read the recent Economist, there's an article that a corporation such as Google is starting to show signs of maturity. And the creative edge that they had when this in a few years back is no longer there with them. So the size itself becomes a challenge for many of these large corporations. So in my view, no, I don't think large corporations are going to be a hindrance for the growth of newer ones, especially in this age of technology.
If I can just add to what Rajiv is saying, I think it's nimble for the younger and the smaller organizations to adapt and to adopt to the new technologies and the new ways. Sometimes the larger giants find it difficult to move, with changing times as quickly as they should. And which is where I think the newer and the younger organizations have a role to play.
Right. All right. So should we move on to the next question for Scott? Right, Scott, this is quite an interesting one. As an investor, which sector would you be most attractive during and post-COVID era, except health and medical?
Thanks. Thank you very much for the call, for that question. I think, again, geopolitics is playing an increasingly major role as we're seeing a polarized global setting. I'm going to run through a list that I've made very, very quickly. So in India specifically, I think technology across the board, extending on what Rajiv has mentioned, from an investor perspective, technology investments offer usually a high rate of return on investment. So from that perspective, as well as the current climate, there is a particular opportunity for technology uptake. E-commerce, I think, is also something that is accelerating given our current circumstances and represents attractive investment. Retail, communication, I think, across the board, and sport and leisure media, I think, is also something which I think has a big runway starting to appear. I think a long-term investment view would be infrastructure, and I also think, and this is a bit of a peg, but I'll go out on a limb because it's what I'm thinking myself in terms of investment strategy. I think that the movement away for India from a cheap manufacturing-based economy to a knowledge-based economy is something in terms of long-term investment that I can see in my own view. I know that you asked me to exclude health care, but quickly I'll just chop in a couple. Traditional healthcare companies, elective surgery has been stalled and there's a huge backlog as a result of COVID. So there are requirements for increased capacity for treatment and COVID, accommodation of COVID patients as well. Also, increasing number of existing Indian hospitals and hospital chains have closed as people are avoiding attending the hospitals for ordinary tests and diagnosis because of fear of contracting COVID. So, and even the governments have blocked elective surgery in particular territories to prioritise ICUs and beds. So there are opportunities within the health sector itself. Also, telemedicine on the back of technology has huge investment potential in India particularly. Safer diagnosis and consultations for doctors and health practitioners in general in both urban areas, but also as well as offering remote access for rural patients via RMPs to tele appointments for diagnosis and assessment of test results. And I'd just like to, on the back of that technology thinking, throw a few figures that I've actually done some research on for today's event. During the COVID event, so this year, I've got some figures of actual physical investment in India made by 4 specific US-based companies. So we have Google, $10 billion US, Facebook, $5.7 billion, Walmart, $1.2 billion US, and Foxconn, $1 billion US. So significant prominent investments are being made on the ground in India right now during COVID. And a lot of that has to do with technology, but technology as it is applied to the culture and the existing business ecosystem on the ground. And this is in line with the increasing urbanisation of India, in my opinion, and the potential growth of both Tier 2 and Tier 3 towns and cities. However, a lot of this investment is based on the attractive labour cost differentials between India and other countries. So that will play a role in the attractiveness and the sustainability of these investments. Quickly in Australia, I think fintech globally, but also in Australia, a cashless ecosystem. We've seen the rise. Many of you may have heard of the buy now, pay later startup Afterpay. We're seeing significant trajectory for Afterpay and other fintech companies as well. Technology, as I mentioned, e-commerce. Now, e-commerce as well is on the back of an increased work from home workforce. Medtech across the board. Now, aviation is another one that I am observing. So within the global travel market, we are seeing the prospect of insolvencies and collapse, both in Australia and worldwide. So there are going to potentially be opportunities for what I would call fire sales for assets and organisations. Regional infrastructure as a result of the decentralisation in Australia from the capital cities, which is in contrast with India. Globally, investment strategies, I would be thinking and looking at technology, particularly cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, particularly virtual meetings with holograms, which is getting beyond our Zoom experience today. Robotics, e-commerce, obviously in terms of fintech, and then I think also we're seeing that China's ascendancy, as I mentioned earlier, will continue. I think that this ascendancy will be turbocharged by the rivalry with an unraveling United States. For instance, China's forecast growth for this year is 1.75%. Its forecast growth for 2021 is 8.25%. There are companies from several sectors currently moving out of China and setting up units in India as we speak this year. So I think that amongst a setting which would at first glance look as if it's stationary and everyone is in a holding position waiting to see what's going to happen, in terms of investment, those that are experienced in the investment space understand that the early adopters get the worm. And so there's plenty of movement happening.
Thank you, Scott. The next one coming in is for Ravneet. Ravneet, according to you, what needs to be the focus now, cost or revenue? And should business invest in learning and development to equip their workforce for the changing scenarios? What are your thoughts on this?
I think the answer very directly will be yes. Businesses will have to continue to evolve. And to continue to evolve, you have to invest in upgrading and upskilling technology and people. And I don't think there's a shortcut to that. However, I think people will start to prioritize more so now than they would have done in the past. And I think that bite size, a here and now approach will be more prevalent, at least in the short term. So I think businesses will want to say two things. One is, if I have to sustain, what do I need to do here and now? And if I have to then move to the next phase of potential growth, then what do I have to do here and now? I think that there will be a lot of scenario building that will happen in the businesses, which will be, if this happens, then what? And if this happens, then what? Because like it is said before, none of us know what the future is going to really look like. We can only predict and we can only have a thought process. So, even in the education business, the university is going through a 5-year strategy plan and it was talked about the 5-year plan in the organization. So the university is going through that phase now. And while, we understand that the future is going to be completely different, but we do know that we have to think futuristically as well. So there will have to be a fine balance, I think, that will have to come through, maybe in the next couple of months when sort of the pandemic starts to hopefully settle down. But like I say, that it will impact building scenarios. Organizations will have 1, 2, and 3 scenarios, 1, 2, and 3 cost structures, 1, 2, and 3 revenue structures. And depending on where the world is going, you will have to move in that direction. I don't think there's going to be more of a wait and watch game, because people will need to come forward and take the action going forward. And whether it is, it is going to be as realistic and as sensible as we have been in the past, I'm not sure. But we will have to start to move in that direction and start to think about futuristic areas that Scott mentioned in terms of our investment and revenue propositions. New businesses will definitely come up, and I think that new businesses, this sets an opportunity for new businesses to come up as well. And I think that's where we should be thinking about optimization of that as well. So it's not all, gloom day, I think. We need to think about where the future is, and future is different. There's no doubt about that. What that different future is will be evolving as we go, but we must plan and proceed with caution and care into the unknown future.
All right, thank you, Ravneet. I would like Mehul now to just go ahead with the questionnaire and answers, the Q&As we have from our audiences.
Thank you, Abhishek. So definitely a very interesting session, and I'm guessing there are a lot of questions that are coming up. Some questions we have in the Q&A session, and some people have also pinged me directly. So we'll start with the question to Rajiv. What do you think will be the change in the consumer behavior, as Udit has asked, and how long do you think this impact will stay? Nobody can figure out right now how long this will stay, but definitely there's going to be some change in consumer behavior. What are your views on that?
We're seeing that not only in this cycle, but whenever they're in times of uncertainty, consumers tend to restrict their behavior in engaging with the essentials, because and especially today when so much is uncertain, people are going to be restricting their spending, uh, their uh, their engagement with entertainment or outings. Uh, of course, there are no possibilities at this point in time, but I don't think you will find that much of cash coming into the economy for quite some time until the situation starts to clear up. Even, of course, somehow the stock market in India seems to be somewhat delinked from what is happening around us at times. But that's essentially because of a lot of external money which comes in through the FIIs. But if you look at the retail consumer, uh, you know, at a time when even the stock markets are volatile, the advice is to refrain from entering the stock market, when it has such highs and lows, on an everyday basis. So I think the immediate behavioral response that we're seeing all around is, spend on the essentials. If you can avoid an expenditure for some time, avoid it, especially with salaries being cut, jobs being lost, people having to dip into their reserves. And I mean, while in other countries there is a lot of government support that is available to the unemployed, in a country like India, you have to fend on your own. So you're dipping into your own reserves that you've created. So at this point in time, I think that everyone's conserving cash. Expenditure is going to be limited. Essentials are going to be, of course, people won't compromise, but even there, I would imagine that, the indulgence that we might have seen at times earlier would be far more restrained at this point in time. So it would have an impact on the economy because, we are not in the buying mode yet. And until we are sure, even people who have jobs, are going to conserve their money and their savings. So that's going to be a phenomena that is going to go on for some time. And corporations are in a survivability mode. They're looking at all discretionary costs, and sometimes, unfortunately, as it may seem, some of the areas that get the cut amongst corporates also are areas that they should be spending on, because sometimes we end up compromising our future. Areas like R&D, take a hit at times like this. But what it does is that when you come out of the situation, you're not prepared for that moment because you've not spent enough in the past. So it's a tough situation, but but survivability is the key criteria for corporates and individuals. I think discretion is going to rule the roost, and people are going to spend on the bare essentials for quite some time until the situation clears up.
Right. Thanks for that. I think we're running out of time. We have about 10, 11 minutes left. Scott, I have a very interesting question for you, again, from Udit. This is about globalization. Say, for example, what interesting thing that he's put up is not meeting people physically, because the travel is going to be banned for next 3-4 months. I'm sure business travel for anybody to travel around would not be possible. Would not meeting physically, will that have an impact on negotiations, and how?
That's a really good question. And I think that there'll be a range of answers depending on the people involved. So there are a range of cultures that we have in human civilization. And there are protocols in terms of communication and engaging face to face. So that in itself has a template that sits over the top of the imposed paradigm of having to interact as we are now online exclusively. But if we step away from things like cultural differences, I've noticed within Australia a lot of commentary from all sorts of people from all different types of businesses and backgrounds commenting on the fact that they're over, and by I mean over, they've had enough of virtual meetings and are really craving the face-to-face interaction that comes, and they're missing that. So I think that there will be a range of different responses to the fact that we have that choice removed currently. As far as negotiations go, I think that those of us that are used in a global business world of interacting virtually online, I think the impact will be less. I think those people that have had to have this imposed on them and they're not as used to it are finding it more difficult to adapt. If I take my own example, I spend more time in meetings with India, even when I'm home here in Australia, than I do talking to people in Australia. So for me, there's been no adaptation required. But I will say this in terms of, and it's my own personal thing, I'd be really interested in an Indian perspective, but my own personal thing is that I find it much easier to relate to somebody and to negotiate, but even just to relate, if I've had the opportunity to forge that relationship face-to-face first. And then from there, to revert back to online interactions, very easy for me. But if you've never met someone face-to-face, that can be a little challenging to forge a trusting relationship upon which negotiation depends, just merely in the virtual paradigm.
Makes sense. Thanks for that. Rajiv, I have a question from Gagan, specifically for you. He's asking about corporates moving towards keeping cash reserves in for future such situations. A quick line on this one.
Before I go into the question, I'll just touch upon what Scott mentioned. In terms, business and humans are very adaptive. So when we are faced with an adversity, we try to find ways around it. And as Scott mentioned, even during the course of the pandemic, when we thought business was kind of affected and things were coming to a standstill, there was $25 billion of US dollars of investment flowing in a certain corporation, and people were working day and night over video conferences and telephone calls to make that happen. Papers were being signed electronically, agreements were being struck. So people find a way, and if there's a certain requirement, it's not the ideal way, and certainly there's no substitute for face-to-face interaction, but we do, the human spirit is such that if we apply our mind to it, we get it done. I'm currently in the midst of a negotiation between an Indian company and an Australian company, and the agreement, I'm seeing the agreements being fleshed out digitally. So we do find a way. It's not the ideal way, and certainly, the question that came up was the Indian team was required to is required to visit Australia to look at the asset, but there is no opportunity in the foreseeable future, so they may have to take a call on the investments based on just their digital interactions. So having said that, addressing your question on cash reserves, the last corporation that I worked was the Aditya Birla Group. And, I think the Birlas have it in their DNA that for them, cash is king. The key the key statement that they pay attention to in reviewing any business is the cash flow statement. So I think it becomes much more relevant in times like this, and it's a learning for most corporates, very many small and medium scale enterprises as well. The handicap that many of the small and medium scale enterprises face is that they don't have that leeway that some of the larger corporates have in terms of building on a cash reserve. They're looking towards much more shorter time horizons. But there's no denying the fact that in business, it's not the net profit situation that needs to be looked at, but it's how you're managing your cash flows. So it becomes much more apparent in a time like this. And if I quote the example of Birlas, I think having built those cash reserves over a period of time in various many businesses, up to now they've been paying their employees. None of the employees have taken a cut in their wages. Their senior management has not had to take a cut in their wages. And their businesses have managed these 4 months of lockdown, despite some of them not being operational for some time, just because they had cash reserves built with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I have one small interesting question again. Something that Scott touched upon was the movement of people from larger cities to tier 2 and tier 3 cities. A similar thing that Saurabh has asked is something like that is happening in India as well, where people are moving from large cities like Bombay to their hometowns, and do you think that will give a chance for these smaller cities to grow up in future? It's a very short question. Maybe a short answer from Rajiv would help.
No, certainly you see many working from home or working from any place digitally was an option that was available to the Indian corporate sector always. But we've been forced to rely on it as much as possible during this pandemic. And what corporates are realizing is that it's possible to get work done irrespective of where people are located. So going forward, I think not in a large way, but there certainly will be a segment of the population, working population, which will have that opportunity to work with a corporate from a location of their choice and still be gainfully employed. Some of the employment terms may change. For instance, like your conveyance allowance and things like that may undergo a change as part of the contract that you might sign. But it opens up an opportunity for people to work from locations that they otherwise thought were not possible. From locations where the quality of life could be much better for them than to have to commute for 1.5 hours to reach an office in a city like Mumbai. So there will be those options that will be thrown up, and I'm sure corporates going forward would be much more willing to take on those employees. There would also be an emergence of a large number of gig employees, specialists, consultants, even senior leaders who having been tuned now to working off the digital platforms may not want to be associated full time with only one corporation. They may want to spread their knowledge and bring their knowledge to various many corporations working from wherever they want. So these changes, I think, are going to gain traction just because there's a lot of experience that has gone on during this time.
Thanks for that. Thank you to our panelists. I think we have that many questions and the time is obviously of the essence. Ravneet, I'll hand this over to you for your kind remarks. on this.
Thank you very much, Mule. And I think that it's been an absolute pleasure listening to both Rajiv and Scott. I think that our alumni here in India, and elsewhere have immensely benefited from your very well analyzed and thought of process and comments and thoughts. Very, very insightful indeed. And thank you for Sam for attending this with us and supporting us from Melbourne as well. Thank you to our alumni who've actually organized this session. So Abhishek and Mehul and Arpit, thank you very much for being with us. I hope you all enjoyed the session. Have a lovely rest of the afternoon and evening, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much.